I want to start off and elaborate a bit on the very kind biographical introduction that Leah provided. And I want to, as many of you may note, some of you may not, however, so I want to be clear. I work for the Weekly Standard, which, as some of you may know, is a center-right magazine. I also write for Tablet Magazine, which is much further to the left, center-left. And I want to, I'm saying this because I want to be able to distinguish in as much as possible what I want to present as fact, the different things that I've seen on the ground, that I believe that most people can agree on, and analysis. And if you have disagreement with either, that's fine, and we'll talk about that shortly. I think that we spoke about me going for something like half an hour, and we'll see. We'll see if I can sustain it that long. I suspect I can, running off at the mouth. But again, I just want to make clear, if what I'm saying seems strictly like political critique having to do with domestic arguments that we have here, that we have in Washington between the Republicans and the Democrats, I have no doubt there's some of that. But also I do want to say that this is how, that there are different things that are happening on the ground which are real. It's not just my political perspective. So first I'd like to be able to work backwards. I want to talk about Syria. I want to talk about what's in the news right now, and what's in the news is the diplomatic activity in Geneva. And I want to be able to give you the basic layout of the purpose of Geneva. The purpose of Geneva right now is to stop the war, against Assad. However, the war against ISIS, from the White House's perspective, should continue. As it turns out, it's really only the White House that is concerned about the war on ISIS. The Russians have never been very interested in fighting ISIS. The Iranians are certainly not interested in fighting ISIS inside of Syria. So there are a number of different converging interests and also conflicting interests. The one thing that the White House, obviously the Assad regime, the Iranians, and Russia all agree on right now is that the war against Assad must stop. My assessment is that this is going to be very difficult to have happen for a number of different reasons. First of all, as we were speaking about before, much of the opposition that was invited to Geneva, the Syrian opposition that was invited to Geneva, is not actually real opposition. It's been opposition that's been approved of by the Syrian regime. It's been opposition that was approved of by the Russians, so they don't really have any say of what's happening on the ground, of what's moving on the ground. So that's one issue. The other issue, which is extremely important, and we'll get into in more detail, and when I come back and when I talk specifically about how things look from Turkey and how things look from Lebanon, is that when I say the war against Assad must stop, or this is the idea behind Geneva, to end the war against Assad, what that really means is since the Jordanian border, since Jordanian support was shut down in the south, what it really means is going after the north. It means shutting down Turkish supply lines in the north. And the Turks, for a number of different reasons, do not want that to happen, and in other ways they cannot afford to let that happen. So this is really where the effort is now. And when you hear the White House talking about the Turks must shut down their border to prevent Islamic State fighters from coming through Syria to Turkey, there's only a small element of truth to that. What they really want to have happen, again, as the Russians, as the Iranians, and they want the support not to go the other way. They don't want logistical support going. They don't want weapons going from Turkey to Syria to aid the rebels. The idea is if they can shut down the Turks, they can end the war. That's what will end the war, because without Turkey's support, there is no more war against Assad. Now, the reason this would be very difficult for the Turks to shut down, it's not simply because of the amount of prestige that the Turkish President Erdogan has invested in trying to bring down Assad. It's also a matter of vital national interest for a number of different reasons. Well, first of all, let me start off with a smaller domestic issue. And the fact is, there may be already 3 million Syrian refugees inside of Turkey. There are some, I mean, the basic numbers are 2 million, but when I was there last week speaking to people, I said, no, that assessment is way too low. That estimate is way too low. It's probably more like 3 million. And most of them are in Istanbul, because that's where people suspect that you can, that's where the refugees believe that they can find work easiest, and also where the services are more readily available. There are other people who say that the Turks are, in different ways, the Turks are somewhat profiting from the influx of refugees, insofar as there are also lots of businessmen who are coming through, and there's lots of business now. In a sense, the way someone put it to me, in a sense, the Syrian border has moved up north, so that a number of the Syrians who were, in northern Syria, they've moved up across the border, and they're now in Turkey. So a number of different, for instance, there's a town called Rihanli, and someone was explaining to me said, I remember Rihanli 5 years ago. You used to wait on a street corner, and really you would have to wait 5 minutes before you would just see one car come by. Now it's a thriving small city of about 400,000 people, and those are mostly Syrian refugees. And so that city, for instance, is doing much better now than it was 5 years ago. So again, but that's one issue for Turkey right now, the refugee issue. The other big issues are Russia. It's an enormous problem for Turkey to have the Russians on their southern border, as well as to the north of them, across the Black Sea. We'll come back shortly to some of the actual detailed movements that we've seen going on between the Russians and the Turks, but that's an enormous issue for them. The fact that the Turks would now have the Russians on that border. The other issue is something we spoke about a little bit before, is I want to be able to clarify what we mean when we talk about the Kurds generally in the region, and specifically what we mean when we talk about the Kurds in Syria. As I'm sure many of you know, there are Kurdish populations throughout the region, in particular in Turkey, in Syria, in Iran, and in Iraq. In Iraq, the Kurdistan Regional Government, the KRG, they're pro-Western. That's an American ally. The Syrian Kurdish group, however, that the White House is working with is the PYD. And the PYD is the Syrian affiliate of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, known as the PKK, which is still a U.S.-designated foreign terrorist organization. I think it's extremely peculiar. I think it speaks to different problems with our current Middle East policy, especially regarding Syria, that at this point the United States is working with an organization that we still believe is a terrorist organization against another terrorist organization. And while lots of people would excuse this and say, well, I mean, I'm sure you've all heard how it's explained that they're very good fighters in the war against ISIS. Yes, that's true, but it should probably also make us wonder how significant the war against ISIS is if it's turning around lots of our Middle East policy so that we're teamed up with this particular Kurdish group. It's not an Islamist group, though the members are Muslim. It's a Marxist terrorist organization. And the PKK has been waging war against Turkey, a NATO member, since 1984. They unilaterally dropped the ceasefire over the summer, and since then while they've been targeting mostly soldiers and policemen, there have also been a number of civilians who've been killed as well by the PKK. Anyway, that's the other thing that Turkey is extremely concerned about. The White House Russia, and Iran all want the PKK to shut down that side of the border, that side of the Syria-Turkey border. And for Turkey, the idea that a PKK affiliate would be responsible for a border that long is extremely dangerous to them. So this is why the diplomatic efforts at this point, I think it's almost inevitable that they will come to naught, that there's not going to be an end to the conflict anytime soon, and I think it's actually going to get a lot larger as other actors will tend to get drawn in, and as the war expands into different places. I wanted to talk about also. I want to talk about U.S. policy on the Syrian conflict. Just give a brief background on that. And then I want to touch on what Israeli policy is in the Syrian conflict, because I think that that's sorely misunderstood, especially over the last few months. U.S. policy toward the Syrian conflict, I believe, needs to be seen in a larger context, a number of different contexts. The first is that the White House is understandably concerned not to have a repeat of the Iraq war on its hands. It doesn't want to see a disintegration in the same way that Iraq was. However, the state is already disintegrated. This is already a problem. And the people who are arguing for a different American policy, a different White House policy on Syria, have not argued to send in U.S. troops, but have argued to take down Bashar al-Assad. And that this is the main problem. This is the main interest for the United States, for American interest, I would argue. And again, this is where I want to be careful about. This is my position. This is my argument. The way the White House sees it is that the vital interest, not the vital interest, but the interest of the United States in the Syrian conflict is to stop the Islamic State and not to stop Assad, not to stop the Iranian access from moving there. In fact, that's one of the reasons why the United States has not worked more actively to take down Bashar al-Assad. In some ways, has not really moved at all. You've seen different efforts, different half-hearted efforts to support opposition figures to work against Assad, and there are a number of different reasons why why these were half-hearted. The most important reason is because the central policy goal for the Obama White House in the Middle East was to get the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal. Many years ago, the president, I can remember back shortly after the war began, in March 2011, actually when the opposition took to the streets and started protesting peacefully. And then when the shooting started, there were a number of different people who argued that taking down Assad, who was the Iranians' chief Arab ally, this would be a major strategic setback for Iran. In fact, the then commandant of the Marine Corps, General James Mattis, said it would be the largest strategic setback for the Iranians in 25 years. And there were lots of people who said that this would be a good thing for the United States to, if we're going to negotiate with the Iranians over their nuclear arms program, it's a good thing to show them how hard-headed the United States can sit at the table with them. And the question was, from many people, why couldn't the president see it this way? Why couldn't the White House see it this way? That this would be a good thing to take out one of the Iranians' assets, to weaken the Iranians and make them go to the table like this. This would push back on them and show them how tough the White House could be. The fact was, the president understood exactly that was the issue. But the idea was, well, let me just say, first of all, it wasn't just external opponents. It wasn't just it wasn't just Republicans who made this argument. There was a very important article in the New York Times. October 2013. It was a fascinating article where you understood it was a report on the administration's debate over Syria policy. And you understood at a certain point that everyone in the administration, all of the cabinet principals, the Secretary of Defense, first it was Secretary Gates, then Secretary Panetta, the then director of the CIA, General Petraeus, Secretary Clinton as well, even the woman who would become the National Security Advisor, Susan Rice. Everyone at a certain point argued for arming different Syrian rebel groups. The one person who didn't, and the article was very specific about this, he was sitting in a corner, barely listening to the debate as it was unfolding. Rather, he was on his BlackBerry answering text messages. The president was very much against this policy. The president did not want to get involved in Syria. He did not want to back proxy forces to take down Bashar al-Assad. And the reason for this was he, as well as anyone, understood what that meant for the Iranians. He did not want to risk pushing the Iranians away from the table. This was, if we see over the history of the last several years, this was characteristic. The same thing happened basically in June 2009 with the Green Revolution, when there were different opportunities for the White House to come out more powerfully in support of the Green movement. Remember, they took to the streets in June 2009 to protest what was almost certainly a fraudulent election. But it's become quite clear now in different reports that the president wanted to stay away from that too. And now you see the Iranian Supreme Leader Khamenei. He keeps tweeting he keeps trolling the White House. He keeps tweeting back at them saying, the president wrote me a letter saying he wasn't going to opt for regime change. Or the president wrote me a letter saying he wasn't going to mess with Iranian assets inside Syria. But this is fairly consistent then, that the president was concerned about forcing the Iranians from the table. And since this was the key foreign policy goal, he wasn't going to do it. So just generally, Syria policy needs to be understood in the larger framework of Iran policy. The key was always getting the nuclear deal with the Iranians. And that's why American Syria policy looks the way it does. I want to talk, I know I'm going to repeat myself in different things and also forget different things, but I hope I'll be able to come back around. I want to talk briefly about Israeli policy in the Syrian conflict. There have been, you may remember back in 2011 when the administration kept leaking and kept briefing reporters that one of the reasons they weren't acting more aggressively in the Syria conflict was because the Israelis were concerned that the Israelis didn't want to topple Assad because they figured that the devil you know is better than the devil you don't know. Well, the then ambassador to the United States, Michael Oren, wrote at least 2 letters, maybe 3, I can't recall, correcting the record, writing the Wall Street Journal saying, this is not how the government of Israel feels. The government of Israel has made a clear decision that we want Assad gone. He's killing his people. He's a catastrophe for the rest of the region. And it wasn't just the ambassador to the United States. Every major Israeli official had come out against Assad at that moment. The prime minister, the president, Shimon Peres, Ehud Barak when he was defense minister, even Lieberman when he was foreign minister came out against it. They were all quite clear. And there were a number of different reasons. It's not only because Assad was a butcher. It was also the Israelis figured the thing that mattered to them about Syria was that Assad kept the Golan border quiet, and that Assad, they believed that maybe someday, they didn't really believe it that much, but they believed maybe someday there will be a peace deal with Assad. After the war started and Assad had started slaughtering Sunnis, they understood quite clearly Assad would never have the legitimacy, even if he survived, to be able to make peace. And this is probably why Assad was never actually going to be a partner for peace, because as the head of a minority regime, You need buy-in from the regional majority, and who also happen to be the majority in Syria, and that's the Sunnis. It's impossible, or I would argue it's impossible for minority populations to make deals with Israel without the buy-in of the Sunnis. And that's why you look, the two peace agreements that Israel has now are with Sunni powers, with Egypt and with Jordan. They don't have it. But when the Israelis tried to, or when they had a peace agreement with the then government of Lebanon, the president of Lebanon, Bashir Gemayel, he was assassinated within about 2 weeks, maybe even less, of striking that agreement. So anyway, those are the reasons why Israel turned against Assad very quickly, and they were very clear about it, even though the administration continued to brief reporters that Israel was one of the reasons they weren't moving more quickly. One of the things that's happened over the last few months, and you'll see why the timing is important, or you may remember when Ted Cruz announced his Syria policy. He said, well, I believe that, there's not really a choice. They're all bad guys. And I take my cue from our good friend, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. He also believes that there's no really good choice in Syria. Well, the reason that Netanyahu started, I wouldn't say equivocate, but the reason he wasn't calling for the ouster of Assad as vocally as he had before is because of the Russian escalation in Syria. For Israeli officials to start announcing very clearly that Assad must go down when the specific reason that Putin escalated in Syria was to protect Assad is not a very good idea, and it would be asking for trouble. So that's one of the reasons why he was less vocal and why he seemed to walk that back. However, if you look at what's actually happening on the ground, you see quite clearly what's happening. Netanyahu and the government of Israel are not equivocating between Assad and the Sunnis, the Sunni rebellions. All of their strikes, all of their attacks are on the Iranian axis. None of them are against Sunnis, not against ISIS, not against Nusra, not against the Free Syrian Army. Israel and Turkey are the only two powers in the world that have been clear that their war is not with ISIS, it's not with the Sunnis, it's with the Iranian axis inside of Syria. They've been careful not to go after Assad himself so much, though some of the time Assad forces have gotten in the way. Their main concern is, as it has been for a long time, to stop Iranian arms convoys from going to Hezbollah. So this is why they continue to strike there. Their key strategic concern regarding Syria is to keep Hezbollah and IRGC forces off of the Syrian side of the Golan. The Israelis are very concerned about the Iranians trying to open up a second front. And this is why you'll remember, it was last January, I was in Beirut at the time, while last January there was an Israeli strike in the Golan and it killed a high-ranking IRGC official, and why it killed the son of Imad Mughniyeh, Jihad Mughniyeh. The Israelis were sending a very clear warning: we will not allow this to happen. We will not allow you to establish a second front coming at us from the Golan, as well as from South Lebanon. The concerns for Israel are quite serious, even though we understand that there's a deconfliction mechanism. And what that means is, it's extremely limited what that means. We were speaking before about an Israeli delegation that came to Washington. It was there about 3 weeks ago, and it included the director now of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And I asked one of the members of the delegation, this was after an attack in Damascus, and this was the first time the Israelis had moved, not just in the Golan, but had moved elsewhere. So that's when they killed Samir Qantar in Damascus, along with a number of much smaller figures, but it was quite clearly targeted to get Samir Qantar. I said, well, so what is the story with the deconfliction mechanism? And they said, it's just about making sure that our planes don't hit each other in the air. I said, that's it? It's nothing more? I said, that's it. It's just making sure our planes don't hit each other in the air. Now, I believe that neither Russia nor Israel want any conflict right now. I certainly believe that neither of them want conflict. However, in an extremely hot zone, whenever there are people on the ground with weapons, there's a very large chance for some sort of conflict. And especially now, as we see the Russians are flying missions not just in the north to close down Turkish assets. The Russians are also flying closer south. In fact, I believe it was just a few days ago they hit different targets in Dera. This has the Jordanians extremely concerned, and it also has the Israelis extremely concerned too. And one of the things to look out for is, because this is happening all throughout Syria, when the Russians are flying missions, the people that they're flying in support of it's Hezbollah. So even though we see quite clearly the Russians are not protecting Iranian arms convoys heading across that border going to Hezbollah, they're still working with Hezbollah. That's who's operating for them on the ground. So again, there's a very big chance for conflict here, and that's something to be on the lookout for in the future. I'll start with Lebanon. Lebanon is a mess right now, and it's not just because of the Syrian conflict. It's mostly because of the nuclear arms agreement. One of the things that I found out is even a number of groups that had been in opposition to Hezbollah previously, like the Lebanese forces, like a group called Kataib, they were all very anti-Iranian at first, but now they're moving closer and closer toward the Iranians, looking to make deal with the Iranians. And there is no other reason aside from this. If the United States has made a deal with Iran, if the West is opening up to Iran, making deals, if the Iranians and the French are making deals, why should the Lebanese, with so little power, Lebanese Christians, why should they hold out? Why are they going to be more pro-democracy than the Western powers who are moving away from this and embracing the Iranians? One of the things that underscored for me, because we were speaking before, is a very important question. What is the United States' interest in the Middle East? Well, it's certainly no longer about oil in the way it was 30 years ago. I would say that the chief American interest right now in the Middle East is to maintain the post-World War II American order of the world. And what I mean by that, in the Middle East, you've heard lots of people talk about the Sykes-Picot lines, the Sykes-Picot borders. They were fake. They never made sense anyway. This is not about Sykes-Picot. A lot of these borders were drawn, yes, after World War I. But these borders and the nation-state system had to be enforced. And the power that was enforcing that was the United States. And when the United States backs off from, I certainly don't believe that the United States needs to be at war all of the time, or the United States needs to be deployed everywhere across the world. But the way to think about this is not that the United States is the world's policeman, or not even necessarily that the United States undergirds the order of the world. It's rather the United States. We've never been like the Soviet Union. We don't believe that everyone has to live exactly the way we do, but we trade around the world, from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific coast. We have allies all around the world. And what does that mean? It means this is partly how we understand the world, through our allies, through our friendships, through our relationships. And that's meant also that different allies, to get closer to us, have tried, insofar as they've been able, to look more and more like us, to fit into the international system that we've created. On both the right and the left, people have misunderstood what that international order means. On the right, what that means is you have a number of different people, colleagues of mine including, you say, this international order, this UN, everyone is international law, what is that? We're losing our American sovereignty to this nonsense about the international order. Like, okay, you have something of a point. But the fact is the international order is an index of American power. There is no international order the way it looks now without American power. The international institutions that many of us scoff at and that many of us perceive as toothless, whether it's the UN, whether it's the ICC, whether it's different aspects of NATO. Yes, in many ways they're toothless, but nonetheless these are still important things, and that's what our power is underwritten. It's the same thing with the nation-state system. So it's hardly any surprise that these things are really falling apart in the Middle East. And that's something you can see quite clearly in a place like Lebanon, which is deteriorating quickly. And again, insofar as there have been democratic aspirations there, liberal aspirations there, why should they, or how do they manage to maintain that position of the standard bearer of liberal democracy around the world, which is the United States, is retreating in very important ways? So for a smaller power like Lebanon, it looks very bad. For other powers, for Turkey, for instance, one of the things that we'll see happen, I believe, is that we will retreat to pre-American systems of the region. I think right now, if you look at Turkey, the major Sunni Arab powers, Saudi Arabia and Egypt, can't really carry the ball. They can't really manage that system. But the Turks are still a power, and right now, this, it seems to be, is who the Sunni Arab, various Sunni Arabs are aligning with. And certainly if you see in Syria, because in many ways Syria is this part of the Middle East where the region has resolved to have a major war. And right now, the two main conflicting regional powers are Iran and Turkey. So I believe if you look at the Middle East, we're going to see, again, we're going to be looking at pre-American structures of the region. Now, where that leaves Israel is a very interesting question. Right now what we're seeing is, because the Israelis and the Arabs and the Turks all share the same interest, which is that the major threat to them is Iran and the Iranian axis. So right now, I think the Israelis are in good shape. As this war continues, though, and if insofar as the war may get larger and may get more violent, things may change. But right now, I'm sure, as many of you know, the Israelis are actively working with Free Syrian Army units on that border to make sure the IRGC and Hezbollah stays off. And many of these Free Syrian Army units are allied with or affiliates of Nusra. So in effect, the Israelis, and they know it quite well, and they're relatively open about it. Like, Nusra doesn't give us a problem right now. They might someday, but right now they're not giving us a problem. And that's, I think I'm going to end it right there so we can move into questions. But I'm sure I've left open lots of different things. I hope I've provoked some questions or arguments, and I'm sure we'll be able to fill out a lot more stuff in the remaining time.
One is about the no-fly zone. What's the prospect of that happening that would stem some of, the immigrant refugee crisis? And the second question is, I read somewhere recently that the Kurds were excluded from the discussions in Switzerland, and that since they're the principal fighting force there, how do you see that playing out?
Let me just say very quickly before I answer your two questions. What we're seeing with the White House is actually truly exceptional. That actually the bureaucracies have very little say in what's happening, which is what I was trying to point at, talking about that New York Times article from October 2013. There are different, I know now from my trip to Turkey, someone was telling me that I've met Davutoglu, who's the Turkish prime minister, and someone told me several months ago that Ehud Barak, then the defense minister, have all come up with the same conclusion, which we saw also in former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates' memoirs. The decision-making is all done by the president. It's all the president. This is actually an exceptional thing. Usually we see much more input coming from the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, the bureaucracies. This is an exceptional thing here. So in that case, the president was the one who did not want a no-fly zone. There were other people who argued for it and argued against it. One of the things that makes a no-fly zone much more difficult now is, not much more difficult, but more difficult, just the Russian escalation. I mean, certainly there would be the United States would need to understand, or would need to make its case to the Russians in a way we've not been able to so far, to protect different refugees fleeing from Assad's depredations. And it is about Assad. This is where the refugees are. The vast majority of refugees are in flight from Assad. They're Sunni Arabs. What we're watching is a massive campaign of sectarian cleansing. This is who's coming to Europe. This is who's in Turkey. This is who's in Lebanon. They're not fleeing the Islamic State. They're fleeing Assad. And so insofar as a no-fly zone would be protecting people from Assad, that will run up against the Russian campaign. So I think it's going to be a lot more difficult now to establish a no-fly zone. Certainly the next administration will have to, will reassess Syria policy, but that's going to be one of the problems they're still going to be coming up against. And if you'll excuse me, I feel bad about this, but I didn't write down your second question, just the first one. If you can just remind me. I'm glad that, yeah, right, okay, I'm glad the Kurds were excluded. I think the Kurds should be excluded. I don't think we should be giving, the way I see it, Turkey is a NATO member. I believe that NATO is still an important thing. These Kurds have been waging, this particular Kurdish institution has been waging war against the NATO member for 3 decades now. I know that they're an important part of the administration's anti-ISIS campaign. I think the ISIS campaign is not important. I think it's not a real campaign. I think it's cover for different things that are going on with the Iranians. We know right now how to defeat ISIS. The president was asking for recommendations last week from his commanders in the field. Everyone knows how to defeat ISIS. There's only one way to defeat ISIS, which is you have to get buy-in from the Sunni Arabs. This is how the surge worked, right? They got Sunni Arab tribes to pick up arms and turn them against Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Al-Qaeda in Iraq is what? It's a combination, or ISIS is a combination of Al-Qaeda in Iraq and the Arab tribes. The reason the Arab tribes will not turn against ISIS right now is because of the Iranian security structure around the region. Until the White House pushes back on the Iranians who have expanded now from Tehran through Baghdad, Damascus to Beirut, this is untenable for the Sunnis. It's untenable. They cannot abide it. So until the Iranians and their allies from Hezbollah and Syria, the different popular militias, the Iranian-backed Iraqi militias, basically under the supervision of the central government in Baghdad, until they're pushed back, there's no way to defeat ISIS because there will be no way to get buy-in from the Sunnis. So insofar as the Kurds have been important in our fight against ISIS, that to me is not even secondary. I think that the main contest to stop ISIS, to stop the war, it's the Iranians that need to be pushed on, not the Sunnis.
But to take what you said, it suggests to me that you're saying we are really in alliance with Iran in this conflict on an overall basis. Would you say that and carry through on that?
Yeah, I think what's happened over the way that I see the, again, this is my analysis. Not everyone sees it like this, so I want to preface it with that. The way that I see the Iran nuclear deal is it's only partly about the nuclear deal. And I think we're starting to see some evidence right now in different interviews and different articles, the president has made clear that there's a larger purpose to this as well. There was an important interview with David Remnick of the New Yorker several years ago where the president was talking about a larger geopolitical equilibrium which would balance the Iranians against the Saudis, the Shia against the Sunnis. Well, yeah, that's part of it, but Israel is also part of this larger regional structure. So I believe that the way the president sees it is it's about a regional realignment. What we believed is our past security architecture in the region, where there was Israel and there were the Sunni powers, there was Turkey as a NATO member, there was Egypt, our pillar in the Eastern Mediterranean, along with Israel. The president wants to bring in Iran. He wants to balance these different figures out. I think that's how to give the more neutral version of this. It's about regional realignment, which is actually regional realignment is not a new idea. This was an idea that the Brits had when the Brits were preparing to leave the Persian Gulf in the 60s. But the Brits were pushed out before they actually got to employ the twin pillar policy. And the twin pillar policy, again, was about balancing the Saudis and the Iranians. That's basically who would watch out for American interests in the Persian Gulf. Well, one of the things that the United States found out very quickly, this is what they found out during the Nixon administration found this out. The Saudis couldn't manage much on their own. The Iranians were really the main pillar for the United States. The problem was the Iranian Revolution of 1979. In some ways, what the president has wanted to do was empower the Iranians. So I would say that's the more neutral version, is to talk about regional realignment where everyone is balancing. Now, the more colorful version, which you were referring to, which I believe, is that, yes, we're moving closer to the Iranians and we're moving further from traditional American allies, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Egypt. And one of the reasons for this is I believe that Obama believes the Iranians are capable of managing more of the region on behalf of the United States than other powers have been. There was an article in Foreign Policy magazine after the Camp David meeting where a number of Gulf Arab officials came to Washington, and one of the readouts from the meeting suggested that Obama was actually speaking, telling the Arabs, said, well, you guys might do a little better if you had an Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps of your own. Qasem Soleimani manages to get different things done in the region, and you guys are coming to us all the time. You come to the United States and you expect us to carry all your water. Why don't you get it done? The Iranians can get things done. And yes, actively, the United States has partnered with Iran and different Iranian allies over the last couple years. When the United States, the bombing campaign of Tikrit that removed ISIS, it was Qasem Soleimani who was on the ground. The United States was flying air support on behalf of the IRGC Quds Force. The United States has been, the intelligence community has been sharing intelligence with the Lebanese Armed Forces Military Intelligence, which is a subsidiary of Hezbollah at this point. So yes, actively, the United States has been partnered with the Iranians throughout the region over the last several years.
When a Russian official last week said that there was going to be some understanding with the Russians, with the Saudis on oil prices, which then the Saudis said, no, that's not the case. What do you see happening with the Saudis and oil prices? Are they using it primarily as a tool to try to hurt Russia, concerned about Iran bringing oil on the market?
Someone who came back from Saudi recently suggested to me, he said, look, one of the Saudis' big fears is that what happens if they try to affect the oil price and they find they can't? And if they sort of expose themselves, that they're no longer, I mean, I think we're on the border. I mean, some of you in this room may know much better than I do, but my understanding is that we're at a transitional moment where while the Saudis, I believe, are still the swing producer, that's about to flip over. I believe that the United States will soon become the swing producer of oil. So I think that the Saudis, the Saudis have been concerned about two things. Or several things actually. They're concerned about the Iranians. So there was speculation that they were trying to weaken the Iranians with the price of oil. They were trying to hurt the Russians, and also they're worried about the United States. They're worried about American oil production as well. So I think that's difficult to to tell, or difficult for certainly difficult for me to assess. I will say one thing about the Saudis though, regarding there's always rumor about the Saudis are especially fragile. The regime is delicate. I actually believe that regime is very strong. What I think the concern is with the oil price going down, I don't think there's going to be insurrection in Saudi Arabia. The different things that will happen because of the price of oil right now is the Saudis are spending an awful lot of money. The Saudis are fighting in Yemen. The Saudis are backing a war in Syria. And most important, or not most importantly, but something that a lot of people have forgotten is the Saudis are floating Egypt between $10 to $12 billion a year. Egypt is a basket case. Once the Saudis, if it continues like this, at a certain point, the Saudis are going to have to, they can't continue to float Egypt forever. And when that happens, a regime that has seemed to have looked very stable, because we believe that Sisi has stabilized Egypt, is going to look like, I believe it's going to look like a mess. And I've actually thought, and lots of people have been mad at me, including different Israeli friends, who say Sisi's great for us right now. He's fine. We know he's not a Philo-Semite. He's not a Zionist. But right now he manages different things for us that are okay. Like Sisi is not just a fool. Okay, we can say he's done some good things, but he's not a particularly bright guy and Nasserist in his vanity and his ambition. But I believe that the coup and the treatment of the Islamists is going to come back, and that's going to hurt Egypt very badly. So I know I know it's sort of spinning off your question, but just talking about the Saudis. So I think that those are the main concerns to come out of Saudi Arabia right now. I look at Egypt. I look at Egypt especially.
On your point that the decision making the White House has been made by the president. Mm-hmm. The starkest example of that is the pivot on Syria. When he established red lines, said John Kerry out, went for a walk in the Rose Garden, I think was it McDonough?
Yes.
And came back and he had this epiphany that he was going to outsource the decision to Congress and never consulted the three most important cabinet people.
He sent Kerry out there, and Kerry gave a Churchillian speech, and then he didn't know that the president had walked it back. Well, I mean, I love the walk in the Rose Garden scenario. He said it was like, something like, God, it's scripted right out of the West Wing or something like that. He's out there.
But I think it makes the point that you were making, that he didn't consult Hagel.
Absolutely.
He didn't consult Biden.
Right.
And he didn't consult Kerry, who together have almost 100 years experience in the Congress.
I think you're absolutely right, but I don't even buy the Rose Garden story. I think at a certain point, he said, "What?" He said, "No, I'm not going to hit Assad's forces. I'm not going to do this. We don't have any idea how this could, rejigger the conflict in Syria. And most importantly, I don't want the Iranians walking away from the table if I hit their guy. I don't want the Iranians walking away." What this did, I mean, it's the effect that this had on different regional players is enormous. Someone had explained to me that there was actually it was the former ambassador, a former member of the diplomatic corps, was explaining that there was a very big debate in Israel, and official Israel at the time, would the president actually use force to stop the Iranian nuclear weapons program? Remember, because all options were on the table. There was a very big debate, but after After that, there was no more debate. Everyone understood that the president was never going to use force on the Iranian nuclear weapons program. That was it. And the way that this affected other actors across the region also affected the Europeans. I mean, the French were ready to go. A lot of people were ready to go. This affected many, many different figures around the region. It was a very big deal.
So interestingly, you've talked about significant change in the exceptional period that we're in right now, seeing the president act on its own. I'm interested in your analysis of 12 months and then the 4 years after that, given the election. How will that unfold? Will it continue that way? Will it be a dramatic reversal? What's your analysis and points of view
No,
on
I think the
that?
next 12 months, I did a piece for Tablet a couple of weeks ago where I said this is going to be it's going to be a year unlike any we've ever seen in the Middle East. I think we've already seen a lot of, look, I mean, the year started with the Iranians setting fire to 2 diplomatic missions and taking 10 American sailors, right? They will continue to, I don't think the Iranians are interested in war, but the Iranians will continue to provoke. They will continue to look for different places. And look, when people said, well, you know, it's a Saudi diplomatic mission, the way they understand this thing, they're pushing against the United States. They don't like the Saudis, they don't like the Sunnis, they don't like the Israelis, they don't like Jews, but the United States is still the power in the Persian Gulf. Whenever they're pushing against the Saudis, whenever they're pushing against the Israelis, they see it, it's all part of our order. It's about us. They're going to continue to push. The question for me about the Iranians has always been one thing. What happens when they go too far? Because they will. It might not happen in the next 12 months, but they will push too hard. What would have happened had, for instance, you remember the plot against the Saudi ambassador in Washington? What would have happened had the Iranians killed not just the Saudi embassy? By the way, we recall there was also a plot against the Israeli embassy. It's something a lot of people forget. There's also a plot against, you know, that embassy. What would have happened had the Saudis kill the Iranians killed 450 American citizens in the capital of the United States? What would have happened? Right? I mean, that's the kind of thing that you have to respond to, right? So this is a major concern. What will happen in the next 4 years? Yeah.
We see which side would take which direction.
The way I see it is Obama's foreign policy has been very consequential. It's going to be very hard to turn certain things around. Lebanon right now is in the hands of Hezbollah, because people now that they're starting to make their beds, and they're saying, okay, this is it with Hezbollah. How do you turn them around? How are you going to turn the Syrian conflict around? There's going to be a lot more people who have died. How do you get the Russians out of Syria? How do you even turn Washington around and say, these Kurds we're partnering with, we have no problem with Kurds, and, you know, God bless the KRG, but we're working with people here that have been designated, you know, foreign terrorist organization. So a lot of this stuff is going to be very difficult to turn around. Some of the things that you can certainly, the next administration, whether it's Hillary Clinton, I hate to name some of the other names, but let's say it's Hillary Clinton. So President Clinton goes, she can go to Jerusalem, she can go to Riyadh and say, don't worry, everything's going to be okay. We're all back, we've got our hotlines back in order, and we're talking, and this and that. That's fine. You can turn that around very quickly. You can go to Erdogan very quickly. The other things, though, are going to be much harder to turn around. Look, I mean, it's not just the Syrian war. It's the Iranian expansionist project, right? They run Iraq as well. The central government in Baghdad, and more importantly, this is what the Iranians do. They replicate the revolution. The revolution, that's what the revolution means. It means creating a parallel structure alongside the state. And that's what they've done in Iraq as well. It's what they always had in Lebanon with Hezbollah, right? Hassan Nasrallah is more important than the Lebanese prime minister. Hezbollah is more important than the Lebanese army. And this is what we're starting to see in Iraq as well, right? Regardless of what happens in the central government in Baghdad, the important thing that's happening on the ground, our people are under control of Qasem Soleimani and his guy in Iraq, Mohandas. So that's a big issue. How do we turn that around? It's not going to be easy if it happens at all. So whoever's going to be president over the next administration, it's going to be hard. And the last thing that someone is going to want to do when they're stepping in is going to say, well, how do we get the Russians out of Syria? How do we manage to force that issue? It's not going to be something someone wants to do right away.
Slightly off topic. I've been
Okay.
reading for 6 years that the Iranians are very close to having nuclear weapons capability, or nuclear bomb, not necessarily a weapon. What's your take? What are you hearing from people knowledgeable about the region as to how close Iran is, or if they already mastered the technology?
I think the most important thing is that, is that the president said that even with the deal, within 15 years, the Iranians will be down to zero breakout. They're going to have a bomb within 15 years, right? I mean, so I can't tell you, I can't tell you where they are now exactly. And I'm sure there are differing assessments around the region. But what we do know, because this is what the president said, is that in 15 years they're going to have the bomb. And this is, by the way, with the idea that there's going to be the kind of inspections and the kind of inspections and the kind of restrictions and pushing back on them. And none of that's happening. Everything about pushing back on the Iranians and snapback sanctions, none of these things are really happening. So we know, or we can assume, it's probably going to be much sooner than 15 years. Right? The 15 years was all about the idea of a rigorous deal. It was going to keep the Iranians in line and keep them from breakout. So all these sanctions were going to snap back. None of these things are happening.
Lee, thank you very much for coming to
having
Greenwich
me.
and visiting with us. I'm sure if there are some additional questions, Lee would be happy to speak with you.
Thanks,
and thank you all for coming.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me again. I appreciate it.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jem, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.